I'm actually delighted to be here. I work very closely with speech clinicians, especially in the Pacific Northwest, but really all throughout the country. And my task, the pieces that I've been asked to focus on, really are going to be dealing with a little bit of the issues of behavior support. So I want you all to take some of the pieces that you know about working with kids who have difficulty with communication, and you all know that having difficulty communicate is directly related to challenges, not just academic challenges, but behavioral challenges. So I want you to be thinking about that. The major thing that I've been asked to talk about, though, is really this notion of how you take things to scale. So we heard this morning about kernels, we heard about programs, we heard about implementation science. Part of what I want you to do is I'm going to do a presentation that is a little less about implementation science and a little more about implementation muddling along, if you would. All right? And all of my slides can be picked up off of our website at SWPBIS.org. The major theme, so in the half hour that I've got, I'd like to present 5 major lessons that we've learned, things that I would encourage you all to think about as you're taking brilliant ideas, elegant programs, sophisticated strategies, and putting them in place. Now, one of the things that Howard allowed me to do, there are a few slides that are different than what you've got in your hymnal, but that's okay. That's all right. Those of you who have trouble with that, it's a deep breath. It's all right, and you've got to know that you can get the slides. So first off, the thing I'm going to talk about, the program or the approach that I want to talk about is something that's called positive behavioral interventions and supports. And it's a complicated title that the federal government basically foisted on us. But essentially, it's this. I want you to think about schools. And I want you to think about how to make schools more effective learning environments, the whole school. And one of the big differences, I know this is going to be tough, I want you to think not just about what you know about individual children or classrooms, which is what we typically have done, right? I mean, I was a teacher. Actually, I was a teacher in Palo Alto. So one of the things that you do is take all that knowledge. One of the messages that we would bring is you will never get the technology that you know about helping individual children, individual families, and individual classrooms to be implemented with fidelity and sustainability if you don't use the whole school as the unit of analysis. So make the school an effective learning environment. To do that well, basically, you can condense the last 40 years of school-based behavioral research into 4 major messages. Make a school highly predictable. Make the environment one in which everybody is clearly aware of what the expectations are. Make it consistent across people, place, and time. So make it so that everybody knows the same messages. Make it extraordinarily positive. Rather than focusing on what not to do, focus on what to do. Think about the messages that Dennis gave us this morning. And then the 4th part is make it safe. Make it safe both physically and make it safe in terms of how the child feels. So the issues related to trauma-induced problems, you've got to have an environment that is welcoming and really works. So part of what we're looking for is we wanted to come up with a framework. And in George's big message, when he talked about how to make George Sugai, who's the person who really came up with most of this, his big message was to focus on the whole school and recognize that students learn as much or more from each other than they do from us, especially when it comes across in terms of the social interaction patterns. If you want to change self-regulation, if you want to change social interaction patterns, you will not do it teaching one kid at a time. You need to teach groups of kids who operate with similar organizational structures. So what we're interested in is backing up and saying, if you want to change the whole school, what are the evidence-based practices that we've learned? What are pieces that actually fit? Well, one of the first things would be focus on prevention rather than remediation. Focus on strategies where you can identify what the most common issues are and prevent them from happening. Then this whole notion of creating something that's predictable, define in a school 3 to 5 positively stated behavioral expectations. So if you were to create an environment, here you go. So you're queen or king of the world, right? You're going to create an environment that is extraordinarily predictable. You cannot have 75 rules, right? You do not define all the things you don't want. No hitting, kicking, spitting, biting, throwing, raping, pillaging, right? Basically, anyone who believes they can come up with a list of what not to do in a middle school is kidding themselves, all right? So focus on 3 to 5 positively stated events. So what do you want? I mean, think about it. You want kids to be respectful of each other. You want them to be responsible for themselves, right? You want people to behave with kindness. You want them to try. There's not that many, and you're going to come up with them in different ways. Don't hide that stuff, but teach those. So teach it very, very clearly. Teach them as behavioral concepts, just the way you teach math, reading, and writing. And then never teach something that you don't regularly acknowledge on a regular basis. Never teach something unless error patterns are actually corrected on a regular basis. And never build something like that unless you have the data systems that will allow you to know, 1, if you've done what you said you would do, and 2, if it's working. So those are the basic things that we learned. What George Sugai did in the mid-'80s is he gave us 4 big messages. Message number 1, social culture really matters in terms of the effectiveness of schools as learning environments. You can use a great curriculum, but unless you establish a coherent, positive social culture, you will not get the effects that you're looking for. Second is, rather than trying to fix one problem after another, start by building a whole school environment that's going to operate. Third, and this is the one I'm going to come back to over and over again, and this is really at the heart of what I want to talk about in terms of implementation. Never plan to implement effective practices unless you put in place the systems that are necessary for high fidelity and sustainability. And practices are always the things we love talking about. I mean, come on. How do you get people to get the sound? What do you do if somebody uses the F word? You know, people love that stuff. But I got to tell you, the stuff that's not sexy is the stuff that produces sustainability and high fidelity. To what extent do you actually have the organizational structures? Do you have the policies? Do you have the staffing patterns? You talked about the funding mechanisms. Those things are not by themselves going to get something in place, but they are critical to fidelity and sustainability. The last part, and this is something I'm going to really come back to. When you build practices from now on, no more practices with one level of intensity. If you build practices, make them work for large groups of people. If you want something to scale up, plan on how do you do it for some people. For those people who it doesn't work, how do you change and modify the intensity and structure? For those people for whom it doesn't work, how do you go up even further? So one of the themes, one of the sort of mantras within PBIS is you have this triangle. The triangle, it fits with those of you who are interested in response to intervention or multi-tiered systems or systems of care structures. It's borrowed from the community health literature. So those of you from the health environment, this is your idea cast onto education. But the basic idea, always start with prevention. Look first at primary prevention. Implement an effective intervention, whether it be reading, math, writing, behavior, communication, whatever it is, it should be something that is extraordinarily efficient and effective that will work successfully with at least 80% of your population. Focus first on prevention. In terms of behavior, this is a giant message because one of the things that if you've worked at all in schools, everybody shows up and we expect the kids to behave well. We wait for them to foul up and then we hammer them, right? So one of Dennis's very first messages to us was be on time and pay.
Dude, I was waiting for that hit.
And is to focus on prevention first. So build that foundation. But the bigger issue is in the old days, we would come up with these programs and we'd manualize them and we'd put them out there and we expected everybody to turn to page 9, say on 9, this is what you do. And it worked great for about 30% of the situations, okay? What we left people with is, what do you do when Elliot doesn't do it, right? And the issue, here's what I really want you to take away. Scaling up means focusing on all. It means focusing on high quality education with equity for all. For kids who have difficulty learning, for kids from different cultures, for kids who don't speak the same language, for kids who come from environments that break your heart. Okay? If you're going to build strategies that actually work for America's education system, you've got to build strategies that are going to have large-scale application. Don't give us something that only works for a few people. Tell me the kernels that make it work. Tell me how it works for everybody. But then tell me, how do I get it to work for the 15% who, they don't need bazooka-level interventions, but they need a little more structure. They need a little more frequency. With literacy, the green part of the triangle is a phonics-based program with explicit instruction for 90 minutes a day, a minimum of 4 days a week, with universal screening, progress monitoring, and effective early intervention. That's the green. The yellow part for literacy is an increase of about half hour a day, decrease in the size of the group, increase in the frequency with which you get feedback. We can do this. Now we actually have tertiary systems. We can do that with behavior, we can do it with math, we can do it with reading. We can do it with communication too, but we need your help, all right? There will always be 3 to 5% of the kids whose primary mission in life is to maintain our humility. Those are the kids who are actually going to teach us best. One of the things that I've learned is good teachers really learn when they pay attention to the kids. Kids who have difficulty learning are the best instructors of high-quality teaching. One of the banes in education are really smart kids who will learn almost any way you teach them, and then you take advantage of it even though you teach poorly. Everybody learns when you teach well. So part of what George taught us is he taught us basically invest in prevention first, so the green part. Actually invest in doing that well. Use multi-tiered systems of support and rapid and early intervention. Focus on the whole school. Focus on extending that into the classroom, and focus on building it in a way that it works for individual kids who have real difficulty. In essence, here are the 3 things I want you to come back to. We talked about efficacy and effectiveness, and that's cool, right? You got to have the data. If it doesn't work, then hey, let's move on. What I'm saying is getting it to work is necessary but insufficient. It needs to work with equity. We are abandoning a huge proportion of children in the United States. 40% of kids in Oregon don't graduate from high school in 4 years. That is abysmal. You want to get kids to communicate. We need to get kids so that they are college and career ready within time. We need kids who have the self-regulation skills, who have the organizational skills, who have the ability not just to have tasks and skills that we've taught them, but the ability to learn things that we haven't taught them, all right? The other part is we've got to do it with a much greater sense of efficiency. One of the reasons why things are not adopted is we have not paid attention to not just how much it costs and how much time it takes to adopt them, but how much it costs to actually sustain them. We've got to have things that are effective, that are equitable, and that are efficient. We have underestimated equity and efficiency in the things that we've built to date. All right, one of the things coming here, Howard would require that anybody who stands up be able to actually document the function, what you do is functionally related to change in student outcomes. So here are the 10 randomized controlled trials that you will all be asked to have tested on before dinner tonight. All right? All right. And those of you who like hierarchical linear modeling, this is all there. Howard can tell you, I grew up as a single case researcher. All of these studies are based on single case methods, and all of these are group design studies. All right, basically, if you don't get quite through all of them, here's the punchline. If you implement school-wide positive behavior support with Fidelity, all right, you do it with 80% fidelity. Here's what you get. You get a 20 to 60% reduction in office discipline referrals. You do it over 3 years, you get a 40% increase in the proportion of kids who will meet state standards on reading and math. You get an increase in the likelihood that kids will actually both attend school and attend class. And you'll actually get an increase in the proportion of 10-second intervals that they spend paying attention to instruction. Turns out, heck of a deal. The more time you actually spend paying attention, the more you learn. All right, who'd have thought? Okay, we actually did the study to show that. Okay, that's like the parachute study. Okay, So it increases the likelihood that the kids identify the school as a safe environment, decreases bullying behaviors, increases organizational efficiency, decreases staff turnover, and it increases the extent to which teachers perceive themselves as being efficient. And the most recent one actually demonstrates a statistically significant effect, modest effect size, only about 0.3, all right, but a demonstration that kids in schools implementing PBIS actually increase the social emotional competence with which they leave. All right, now, we currently do this, and the reason that Howard invited me to come, we're currently working with nearly 20,000 schools. So we actually have PBIS implemented in about 20,000 schools. And this is by state. And you can't read this, but this is states in alphabetical order. So there are over 1,800 schools in Illinois that are implementing PBIS. There are nearly 1,400 in Florida. There are about 1,200 in North Carolina. There's about 788 schools in California implementing PBIS. Now, the thing I want you to know is, those of you who are from California, there are 10,045 schools in California. So the question I want you to ask is, you think, boy, 744 is a lot, and then you stop and say, well, it's really not very much. So you say 20,000 schools, that sounds like a lot. There are 110,000 schools in the United States. Our job is to get to at least half of the schools in the United States before George retires. We need help. All right? So part of what we're looking for, given that history, what can I tell you about what we've learned? So first off, I would like to echo some of the messages that Renee gave us, because we have sat at the feet of Dean Fixon and Karen Blasey. We actually believe that attending to implementation variables, to the drivers, the stages, the cycles, makes a difference. But part of what we've learned also is focus on the systems. And in education, and I'd encourage you to look at this, be careful about the unit at which you are having an impact. Here's what we've learned. In the United States, school districts are the unit that controls education. School boards make decisions, they have funding. And for all the money the state and the federal government talk about, it's trivial compared to what school districts control. You want to change schools, you must change districts. Districts are the unit of implementation. Schools are the unit of analysis. The whole school, remember, change the whole school. And children and their families are always the unit of impact. We've got to hold ourselves accountable for what we're trying to change and where we change it. So within PBIS, here's what we've learned. We no longer work with individual children or schools. We only work with districts. When we start with a district, we want to see a leadership team. I will meet with superintendents from Salinas and San Jose, partly because they are looking at implementing PBIS. They have high rates of gang and child violence in their schools. So part of what we're going to say is, look, they want to know, what can you do tomorrow to deal with Leonard? And what we'll say is, we know a lot. We can help you a lot, but we will only do that if you actually change the organizational system and will produce high fidelity over a sustained period of time. Never implement something that won't last for a minimum of a decade. Never implement something that you don't expect to last for a minimum of a decade. All right, so we want a leadership team. Leadership teams always want local demonstrations. Dennis is exactly right. The fact you can do it in Pennsylvania is irrelevant to people in California. The honest truth is the fact you can do it in San Francisco is unrelated to the people in San Diego, right? So it's got to be local. So any leadership team, the thing they want is, can I give you some schools and can they be pilots or model demos? The answer always is yes, yes, but never implement little tiny trials unless you build the organizational capacity for sustainability, right? For how long? Minimum of a decade. All right, you guys are all right. See, I don't care what Howard says. All right, so here's the deal. You want to have a leadership team, it needs to have these features. Can you show me the funding that will allow you to continue focusing on this for a minimum of 3 years? Can you right now tell me how you will communicate with the community, with the families, with the businesses, with the colleagues? Everybody needs to know, what are we doing, is it working, and how is it going to work? Do you have the political support? And one of the things we look for is, if we're going to come into the district, is the superintendent of the district going to ask how you're doing at least twice a year? Unless she or he is asking how you're doing, come on, doesn't work. And don't tell us to come in and help you out unless you're actually going to build that. And do you actually have the policy structure set up so that if we put this in place, it'll work? I'm going to come back to that. Now, if the leadership team has that, here's what we've learned to build. You always start with teams in the schools who do things, and I got to tell you, it's a blast working with teams in schools. It's embarrassing that we get paid to do that, all right? But here's the hard part. At the district level, always build the training capacity so that when you have done it twice, they can replicate it from then on. So you need to always be training trainers. Never train trainers unless you train coaches. And I'm going to come back to the coaching part. Renee raised this, but it is much bigger than what we think. If you're going to do behavioral support, you need behavioral expertise, language support, math support, reading support. To get to the top tiers, there's no school in the United States right now that doesn't have all the resources it needs to implement the green level implementation of PBIS. No school. Every school in the United States can implement that. But to get the yellow and the red stuff in place, you actually have to have some knowledge. And that's where you got to build the expertise. The same is going to be true with communication. You've got things you can teach that everybody could do related to organizational features, to build good communication systems. But to get to the kids who have more difficulty, right, we need to say, where do you get that red level and yellow level support? All right, the other part is never do this stuff without evaluation. And everybody here, I mean, come on, you all are mammoth evaluators. You've got, collectively, we've got a gazillion units of data right here in this room, okay? Here's what I can tell you. Most of the data that we have is focused on kid outcomes. To what extent does stuttering occur? To what extent does phonemic segmentation occur? To what extent do behavioral problems occur? To what extent do health education issues occur? All right? I want you to add this. Getting kid outcomes without measuring fidelity of implementation is ineffective. I want you to be able to say, are we doing the intervention? As often as you say, is it working? So if we do that, that's the system. Now here's the slide that Renee gave us. And these are the two mentors. This is Dean Fixon and Karen Blasey. And I would echo, we use, part of what I'm doing is I'm saying we have listened to what Renee did. We've been doing this. But here's what we've learned. Here's what we've learned. I want you to really pay attention. This is the part of the drivers that focuses on building competence. And I really want you to think about the competence you're trying to build in regular education and special education teachers being effective at delivering speech, language, and communication skills. Think about the extent to which you're trying to get families to assist their children in implementation of speech, hearing, language skills, all right? Here's what we've learned. We love training. We love it. We do training like you would not believe. As a group, we are great. We're actually good trainers as a field. You are. You're good. Here's what we miss. To what extent do you really focus on teaching people how to select people who are knowledgeable and effective? So for example, one of the things I will train superintendents in tomorrow is if you're going to implement PBIS, I want you to build into every job description from custodian to superintendent. Are you knowledgeable and skilled in implementation of multi-tiered systems of academic and behavior support? Nobody gets hired without being asked that question. Nobody gets hired without going through the interview process. How do we know if you are skilled? Not just at, I know how to do this one. Great. That's a green level strategy. Do you know how to do yellow and red? Do you know how to fit together? Do you know as an educator how to work with mental health, juvenile justice, and communication specialists? Do you know how to know if what you're doing is working? Second is, never train something unless you coach it in real time, in real place. Coaching is the process of building fluency and adaptation. Fluency, I learned something. Can you do it the fast way under real conditions? Adaptation, how can you do it with Elaine given that you practice with Leonard? Because Elaine doesn't do it quite the same way. How do you adapt and make it fit this environment? Well, we've got kids, we want to focus on having kids show up on time. But come on, give me a break. You got to adapt it to the local context. So part of what we're really learning for, you said you're going to give me 30 minutes, right? Okay, so part of what you're looking for is how you're going to make that work across a much larger area. So part of what I would say is focus on getting all of those drivers in place. Focus on the stages, just like Renee told us, and focus on the cycles. The other part that we have learned is to really focus on measurement. We can now measure not just what happens in classrooms and schools, but the SISEP environment has actually taught us how to also do capacity of districts and capacity of states to implement evidence-based practices. I encourage you to go to sisepassessment.org to look at measures of putting that in place. The last piece that I'm going to get into is I really want to focus on the extent to which we implement not just practices but core features. And the way that we frame that, we see PBIS as a framework with practices that have core features that affect outcomes. Now, part of what we learned this morning, what I'm calling core features are kernels, right? And breaking those out, the piece that I would say in terms of scaling up, focus not just on the little pieces, but also the overarching pieces that make it work. One way to think of it is if you do these kernels, the thing that it frees you up to do is it says there's not one way to do it, there are many. And we don't get locked into practices, we get locked into building environments that have those core features. If we do that, we can separate our values, which is what we view as the outcomes, from the science, which is what really works, from the technology of getting that science in place. We need, when we identify good practices, to be much better at not just saying what they are. What do you do? We need to say, for whom is it intended? Who needs to be able to implement it? Under what situations, and what are the outcomes? We have not described our practices with the level of precision that we've needed in the past. If we do that, it will allow us to implement, not just by asking if kids are successful, but asking if we've actually put it in place. Think about this. This is a school. Look up here at the data. Think about the green. These are 2 points in time, the green time and the blue time. You can look up there and say, at the green time, don't think of all the things you're not doing right. Pick two. So let's pick these two. Well, look at the blue time. Did it work? Yes. And not only that, we got some additional benefits. But what are you going to do next? We're going to focus here next. You don't have to do everything all at once. Using Fidelity as a measure is a powerful strategy for getting things in place. Here's 20,000 schools by state. The red bar indicates the proportion of schools that measure Fidelity. The blue bar measures the proportion that are at criterion. For 20,000 schools, I can tell you that 75% are implementing with 80% fidelity. Implement with attention to the kernels. Be more flexible about how you actually embed the practices. And over again, if you want to implement to scale, implement with the systems that will allow you to sustain things with high fidelity for a minimum of a decade. Thank you.
We'll take a question while we're switching over.
So the question is, give us an example of the things that you measure. So for PBIS, part of the core features are the extent to which you've identified 3 to 5 positively stated behavioral expectations, the extent to which you have an acknowledgement system that acknowledges kid on a regular basis for doing things the right way, the extent to which you have a correction system that is not a punishment structure, but actually is a corrective feature that decreases the likelihood that problem behavior is rewarded. We can measure that in schools by asking schools a set of questions, by going in and we actually stop the kids. We say, kid, do you know the behavioral expectations? Do you know what it means right here? Has anybody acknowledged you for doing things the right way in the past 2 weeks? And basically what we get in schools that are working well is the kids know the expectations. They can actually tell you what being respectful means wherever they are. The flip side is Oftentimes we say, has anybody acknowledged you for doing things the right way in the past 2 weeks? No. Teachers always think they're much more positive environment than the kids do. But if we get the teachers asking those questions on a regular basis, they figure out, not by things we told them, but by things that they figure out on their own, how to get that accomplishment. So that would be one small example. Does that help?